And we spoke to the journalist who interviewed Osama bin Laden's family in their first ever interview to the media. From who is carrying Osama's legacy forward to the rise and growth of the ISIS in West Asia, Martin Chilov opens up on his experience of interviewing the dreaded terrorist family. Take a look.
A very warm welcome to you, Martin. First of all, let me congratulate you for being the first journalist to interview bin Laden's mother. And my first question to you is that the Saudis have allowed in Osama's wives the pictures, and you say this in the article also. How the Osamas have thrived and stayed wealthy under the Saudi regime? Do you foresee any of their influence waning?
The bin Laden family have been very important in Saudi society for many decades now. They have a construction dynasty, they built a lot of the country, and they have access to the establishment. However, in the last year, 3 of the founding members of the family empire have been locked up by the Crown Prince on corruption charges. He's tried to come to an arrangement whereby they sign over a large number of their assets to the state in return for their freedom. So the relationship between the family and the state has been fraught, not just in the post-bin Laden era, but certainly in the past 12 months as well. And I think that's an important backdrop to why this interview actually took place.
Right. Martin, at one point you say the family had gone to Afghanistan and met Osama bin Laden. This was a time when the US and international agencies had launched a global hunt for Osama. Clearly, the Saudi government must have been in the know then, isn't it?
Absolutely. They went twice in 1999 to visit him in Kandahar. He was staying at an airbase that the Russians used to use during the Soviet occupation there. It wasn't a particularly difficult place in which to find him. And the family visits did follow the US airstrikes on nearby bases, or missile strikes, I should say, that followed the bombings in Tanzania and in Kenya the year earlier. So in 1999, the family had gone to visit. They had to have gone with the permission of the Saudi state, who knew who they were visiting. I think that the explanation would be that they were sent to provide a message to bin Laden, and in some quarters have actually acknowledged doing that. It didn't come up in the context of my interview, but the point you make is a valid one. At the same time that the West was looking for him, the Saudis seemed to know where he was.
Right. Martin, you also say in the article that a Saudi minder was present when the interview was being conducted. The interview itself has been timed for impact alongside all the measures that bin Salman has been taking of late. Skeptics might see it as part of an elaborate choreography that the Saudis want the world to see. What's the sense that you got?
Well, it certainly wasn't like that, and it was my initiative to speak to people from the family. I had to put the request not just to the family but to the state themselves. There were tentative approvals over many months. There was lots of negotiations about which photos should be used, which shouldn't. There was never any attempt to direct any questioning. The minder who was in the room played no interfering role whatsoever. While there was clearly permission needed to be granted to conduct these interviews, what I didn't sense is that they were looking to push a particular line. They seemed confident in the narrative of the family, right. and the family, who hadn't been spoken to by anybody from the state in several years prior, did not appear to be acting under any instruction at all. They seemed to be very sincere in what they were putting to me. They were very nervous and very cautious about the discussion. But part of their calculation, I guess, was to win the favour of the House of Saud again after so many years in exile, and also trying to secure some relief, I guess, for the 3 bin Laden brothers who at that point remained locked up by the Saudi state.
Fair enough. Martin, this is the first pictures of Osama's mother, as we know. You have released only a few pictures and also clearly not all details of the conversations you have made with the Osamas have been revealed. We read through that excellent, actually I read through that article, I must say it was excellent, and yet I ended up craving for more. Should we expect more reports out of this interview?
Out of this interview, perhaps not. I think what I would like to think is that it perhaps has creaked open the door for further cooperation down the track. This remains a very deeply suspicious authoritarian state, which is not used to independent journalism. So allowing correspondents such as myself to have more or less unfettered access is something that they're still getting used to. I would like to think that on the back of this, in which there has been some good faith reporting done, and we may be able to do some more. But as far as this interview goes, I think more or less 90 to 95% of what we've discussed we've published.
All right, Martin, was there also a video recording? Can we expect any video footage of this interview?
There was no video recording. There was certainly talk about that, and we did push for it. But that was one thing that the Saudi state weren't prepared to allow.
All right. Martin, 17 years is a long time. All these years, no one got to meet them and tell their story. While the mother has one story to tell, Osama's wives may have another. His brothers and sisters may have another. None of them, except the mother's story, is out. When can we get to hear the others' stories, according to you?
Well, I think you're right to talk about the wives. There are 3 surviving wives. They are in Jeddah, and they would certainly have a story to tell. I'd be fascinated to sit down with them, particularly those wives who were in the compound in Abbottabad in Pakistan when the US Special Forces killed Osama bin Laden in May 2011. Those are the sorts of characters that I think would be essential to make contributions to the historical narrative about bin Laden, which remains such a contentious issue in Saudi society and such a stain, a painful stain in the US in particular.
Right.
I think there are many voices that can contribute to this discourse, and hopefully we'll be able to bring you some in the next few months or so.
All right, coming to your forte, Martin, which is the Middle East. You have rigorously covered the Middle East and interacted with the ISIS. Do you see a way out of a diabolical mess like the ISIS, which is posing a threat to key stakeholders in the region like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, France, UK and Turkey?
Well, ISIS is more or less militarily defeated at the moment. They have taken very significant strategic blows in Syria and in Iraq, and they remain confined to a narrow strip of land which they can defend along the Euphrates River Valley, bordering Syria and Iraq. There's about 2,500 dug-in fighters and their families, and they have pockets elsewhere, but they're not terribly influential. There's a pocket near the Jordanian border. There are some residual sleeper cells in Iraq, and certainly some in northern Syria itself. Can they reorganize and pose the threat that they did from 2014 through to 2016 when they controlled a huge swathe of land from Aleppo to Mosul? I don't think so at the moment, and I think that they've conceded themselves that the land that they controlled is no longer something that they can secure. They thought they could for a bit, but they overreached.
Right. Also, how do you view President Bashar al-Assad's position? Do you think he's being used as a bargaining chip by Russia and Iran?
Bashar al-Assad is a weak president who is very much in the thrall of Russia and Iran, who have won this war for him. If it weren't for his allies, he would have lost Damascus and the country several years ago. And that is not contested at all by his allies. His military was very tired by the time the Russians turned up to help him in late 2015. And his ground forces could not have taken Aleppo. They could not have taken eastern Ghouta either. And they didn't make much of a dent against ISIS in eastern Syria, it must be said. So the future of the country remains very much dependent on the will of those who have won the war, in particular Moscow and Tehran.
Right.
And both have competing visions for what they would like to emerge from the ruins of Syria.
Right.
And therein lies the potential for conflict. The Russians will not abide a theocratic state if the Iranians choose to push for that, and the Iranians will not abide the Russians having aegis over large and important aspects of the Syrian security establishment. So where to from now? And vis-a-vis Israel, which is particularly exercised by the Iranian presence closest to its border, is probably going to be the story of the next 6 months,
right,
in the Levant in particular.
All right, Martin, South Asia is becoming a fertile ground for the ISIS, inspiring Muslim youth from different parts of the world, including India. How do you view the situation of ISIS in South Asia?
One of the things that ISIS did do before it lost its so-called caliphate is successfully export its ideology in small numbers, but small but significant numbers, to various parts of the world: North Africa, Yemen, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, which was an important outpost for it. And I do think that the security evidence shows that South Asia is going to be a staging point at some point in the short to medium term. We're not talking large numbers of people here. We're talking maybe a handful of dozens, up to 70 to 80 hardcore ideologues who were able to flee from Syria and Iraq over the last couple of years. They're laying low. There doesn't appear to be much attempt to actively organise, but they have strategic patience. This is something the organisation has been good at for many years now, through all of its prior incarnations. And it will be very interesting to see what sort of a toehold, if any, it can establish in South Asia.
Right. Very rightly mentioned by you, even though Central and West Asia has managed to contain ISIS, do you think bin Laden's son, Hamza, who is also a global terrorist, could spell a new revival for the ISIS, at least in South Asia?
Well, Hamza is still very much affiliated to Al-Qaeda, it must be said, and Al-Qaeda remain at odds with ISIS, even though they do share large parts of the ideology, the Salafist jihadist ideology. Al-Qaeda views ISIS with great suspicion. That may change, but for now, Al-Qaeda is relatively self-contained. Hamza, as you say, Hamza bin Laden, is the heir apparent to his father. His half-uncles acknowledge that, and Hamza himself has been very visible about saying he will avenge his father's death. So he is seen to be effectively the deputy to Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda. From what I understand from the family, he has married the daughter of Muhammad Atta, and Muhammad Atta was the lead hijacker on 9/11. So what that shows, and that's the family's understanding, is that the alumni of 9/11 still remains very active. And I do think that Hamza is going to evolve into a significant security threat in the short term. It may involve some synergies with the Islamic State, but that trajectory is not yet clear.
All right. In your interview, Osama's mother, Alia Ghanem, has talked about how Osama was radicalized in Jeddah by Abdullah Azzam, who is also another radical youth of the Muslim Brotherhood. Talk about the role of brainwashing in terrorism, and that's my last question to you.
Abdullah Azzam was a very important figure in Osama bin Laden's life. We'd known that prior to the interview with his mother, and it was interesting to have it reaffirmed by her, and she named him in particular, as did the brothers, that he had played a significant role at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah. He was the spiritual advisor to Osama, and he was right there with him when he did form Al-Qaeda many years later. So right throughout his formative days and his transition from a religious zealot to a global jihadi, Abdullah Azzam was there, instilling in him an ideology that was drawn from the scriptures that the Muslim Brotherhood were practicing at the time, and his teachings remained instilled in Osama right throughout his life.
Right. Thank you so much, Martin, for bringing us your precious perspective and sharing this experience with us here on WION. May you continue to come up with such intellectual journalistic pieces in the future as well. Thank you so much for joining us here.
You're very welcome. Thank you.